Hey guys, this is Lucas from Better Coding Academy. I'm joined today with Patrick again, and today we're going to be talking about getting started with React. And I've got my list of things that we're going to cover right over here, and we're going to first start off with what not to do, because very, very commonly people start talking about what you should do to learn React the quickest way. But actually what's more important with React, in my opinion, is that to understand exactly what not to do, because there are so many ways that this can go wrong. So it's important to understand those before jumping in head first. So I would say that the first thing that you should not do when starting React.
We can wait for that.
Is that an ice cream truck?
It's an ice cream.
Yeah.
It's an ice cream truck.
All right.
Yeah, we can plow on. Don't worry.
It's all good.
Up to you.
Yeah. So what not to do is to jump into React before becoming a JavaScript expert. Now, this one to me is kind of like saying learning how to become a chef before you even know basic knife skills. Like that to me is like JavaScript is nonetheless the backbone of React. And I think if you don't know JavaScript, it's very hard to get into React or to get React to a certain level. Patrick, what would you have to say about this one?
Yeah, definitely. Of course, JavaScript is like a huge topic, right? And it can go really deep and really wide. So you can't necessarily master it, but definitely you should be at least proficient. Understand, the differences between class properties, classes, functions, scoping, little syntax things, and maybe even the difference between some of the ES6 methods like .map versus the old pushes and things like that. So you should definitely be good at it before you pick up any framework, really.
And I would say that in particular, actually, .map is very useful in React. So specifically, you should actually know .map, but that's another thing. And what would you say is kind of the more intricate details that you should know within JavaScript? So functional programming would be something as well, you would say?
Yeah, so inherently, right, React is sort of functional. So there's this whole thing about there's a lot of functional principles like immutability, how components kind of render each other. So basically it's just functions wrapped on top of each other. And then a lot of the times when you code in React, right, it's very functional so higher order functions, higher order components. And honestly, if you don't know anything about these functional principles, you're not going to understand why composition exists, composing, and why hooks exist, higher order components exist. And these are the things nowadays that you see every day, right?
Yeah.
It's come to a state where you're kind of expected to know. So yeah, you definitely need to know functional principles as an extra star here. You can't avoid it.
Yeah, so I would say that that's quite important. Many people make the mistake of jumping into React without knowing good levels of JavaScript. You don't have to know every single JavaScript library out there, but the base language, what is called vanilla JavaScript, you should be reasonably proficient with that. Maybe you could consider yourself an intermediate level vanilla JavaScripter, and then you can start picking up React and learning both at the same time. Now, the other thing that many people consider as this is one I've seen as a more specific issue, is they treat React as an object-oriented framework. And what I mean by that is people start to think of React not as functional programming, which Patrick just mentioned, but as an object-oriented system. So then when they see that React is using classes, which actually is kind of getting slowly out of date now as well, is that they see React as some sort of system where we can use objects and use the concept of classes and extend from that. However, that's not the approach that React is taking, and it kind of goes against the fundamental values. Because Patrick, would you say that, you said before as well, state is a very immutable part of React? So a lot of React, in terms of unidirectional data flow, in terms of immutable state, all of these are actually functional programming concepts, but these concepts aren't kind of replicated within strict object-oriented programming, which is one of the big critiques of OOPs, that it's hard to predict. So actually when you work with React, just remember to treat it as functional and to work with a lot of the things associated with functional programming, as opposed to treating it as a strict object-oriented framework. And for number 3, this one is one that kind of bugs me personally as well, because with the many students and many people I've dealt with, they will talk about using one library and being proficient at a library as the solution to any given problem. But so they'll say, oh yeah, I'm using Angular for this project. You don't need to worry, it's going to be perfect. Or I'm using Vue, and they're treating that as the solution. And even with React. But it's very important to remember that every single front-end library is designed to achieve a specific purpose. But however, as the developer, you need to make sure that you implement that properly. So even with like with React, you have to understand that there are many ways that you can go wrong and many ways that you can improve and use it well. So it depends on how you use it. And Patrick, maybe you'd like to share like a few things regarding like this one.
Yeah. So like there are a lot of competing front end libraries out there, and to be honest, sometimes you don't even really need a library. Like you can just use a smaller framework or something like Zepto if you're doing something small. But anyway, I think React is actually a bit special because it tries to be the least library frameworky of them all. So basically there's not a lot of red tape, right? In React, you can kind of do whatever you want, and it kind of works. The problem is that because there's no red tape, there's many like red paths that you can go wrong.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think so many people get the entire code base wrong, and then it's too big. Like they just gotta keep plowing on with like the wrong architecture.
So you would say that like structure and architecture is really important when it comes to this.
Yes, when it comes to React specifically, yeah. So like if you're not extremely confident with React, maybe like, or like if you haven't used any other frameworks before, definitely like check them all out at a very basic level before you just like kind of make a very biased decision simply because you're the best at React.
Yeah.
So far. Yeah. So at the minimum, I think you should be able to read Angular in Vue code.
Or at least understand, I guess, where they're coming from as a principle wise.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because there's a lot of patterns across different frameworks that are good, and not one single framework has all the good patterns, right? So even though you're trying to do something in React, right, you might remember that Angular does it in a certain way that is quite nice, and you can kind of borrow some of the styling. Yeah, and that's kind of what makes really good code.
So I guess like also that reminds me of Dan Abramov. He posted recently about algebraic effects, and you actually linked me that one. So this is something that is currently being investigated at like a research level. So it's not in many programming languages, certainly not in React. But then the actual concepts of algebraic effects are actually brought into React in many ways. So it's actually quite similar to error boundaries, also quite similar to the suspense context. So it's important to remember that with front-end frameworks, that the exact way you write your code, whether it be Angular, Vue, React, they all have a fundamental basis, which is in mathematics, in logic, in programming. And it's important to realize and understand those logical things more importantly than actually, understanding React specifically. So that's what I'd say for that. And then this one is more of like a kind of, once you get started with React, myself included, when I first started using React, one of the first things I learned was Redux, and actually specifically Redux form. So that was something that I picked up literally day 2 of starting React. And one of the problems I started to realize was that like I started using Redux form and I couldn't figure it out. So I went back to Redux and I started using Redux a lot everywhere because I thought that this is better than using local state because it's a library. It's made by some guy who works at Facebook. So it must be really good. So then I started using that a lot and I used it for everything. And now looking back, the problem with that is that actually went too far and I misused Redux for a lot of purposes. So that's just what happened for me when I was kind of getting started. What about yourself? Like, do you have any similar experiences like that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think React is in a state right now where you almost have to have a state management library. Like it's almost not optional. Like even though React ships itself, and technically you can use the React API to do everything you want, right? But it's just not feasible. Like you have to use a state management library to some degree, like, I don't know, Redux, GraphQL, MobX, whatever, right? And the problem with that is like you would probably start off in a code base that primarily has that pattern already set up. So then you would find the easiest way to get your like specific task done. So say you're given a task, right? Example is like, show some autocomplete. Put a little drop down and type in stuff, fetch API autocomplete, and you're like, what's the you search through the code and you'll see like people store data in this, kind of in browser database, Redux, right? Local storage, yep. And then you're just like, that's the easiest way because all the code and helpers are all set up for you. So you just whack it right in there. But something like autocomplete, in most cases, is local to the component. It's a throwaway state. You really shouldn't be putting it in a global state.
So this is kind of like
you make mistakes like that.
So you see like this conflict
Yeah.
where there's existing code which might not necessarily reflect the best pattern, but so then you're kind of like, okay, do I go with this existing code which makes my life easier for the meantime, or do I try and like deviate from the standard which is set within my company? So both of those are like, it's like a lose-lose situation, because in one way your app kind of gets worse, and in the other way, well, you're meant to follow your team's patterns as well. So it's like, you know, you're kind of stuck in the middle there.
Yeah, I think that's where be prepared to second think your solution and be able to answer questions about your solution.
Absolutely.
Even as a starter. Yeah. Like you got to say you pick state, you got to be like, oh, why did I pick state? Like the reason could be wrong, but at least you have a reason.
Yeah.
And your reason could be as dumb as like, oh, you know, I saw a guide on Stack Overflow.
Yeah, and that's truthfully though, like maybe a surprising number of business decisions are made that way. Someone else is doing this, we have to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I would say that also it's important, I think, for companies, and one thing that many companies don't do well enough is to develop a technical team like culture or a language.
Yep.
So like
Totally
people
agree.
like, maybe it's just the way developers are. It's like when we kind of get together and we write code for a single company working for a single boss or whatever, we still somehow value diversity over the quality of the code base. So I feel like we all have different design patterns and we all have different ways of doing things, writing code, but that when we work together for a single company, that we should somehow try to merge these and have a single vision. So when we have, like, say, an architectural decision of using Redux in a specific way or working with local storage in a specific way, that needs to be respected by all the developers from top to bottom. And if that isn't the case, then what happens is you start getting deviations and you start getting parts of the state which are stored in the wrong places.
Yep, I agree. I think that's totally right. I think people are too defensive about their code. So the whole diversity thing, right? So people want to silo and own their code, you know, do the stuff, and then just have no one look at it. It's like they'll be like, what does your thing do? You know, how does it operate? And you just be, you know, just give them the readme.md. Yeah. Don't look at my source code. Yeah. You know, you don't need to know how it looks like. But in the same way, I think people need to be just more transparent with how they do things and be like open-minded and accept if they're kind of wrong or if code has evolved from the state they already know.
And it's important to realize that, like, it's not a personal attack when someone says your code is bad. Like, if someone says you're a terrible person or you're a bad developer, you're an idiot, then that instantly becomes personal. But if it's like, your code is not what we want, this is not efficient code, this isn't what our company, this doesn't fit in with our company tech culture, then that's a totally fine, it's an impartial statement. Yeah. So I think it's important to realize that as well. And that got off track real quick, but yeah, so I just think that with Redux and like global state options, it's very important to have that to understand that from a structural perspective. Just to add one more thing, even though it's off track, it's there still needs to be a loop for you to feed ideas back in. So even though the company is like, oh, you know, we've decided to do it this way, right? There has to be like at least a way to question it in the future, because then you end up with like a 10-year-old rule or like a 10-year-old law that's just uncontested. Yeah, and no one dares to times have changed. Exactly. Yeah. So, but anyway, that's a different matter. Yeah. So then, do you think there's anything else regarding functional programming that you want to touch on?
Functional programming is so weird, man. Like there are purists, like extreme functional purists, but JavaScript is not like that, and React is also not like that. It uses the principles, but it's not like strictly functional, right? So you can get away with mutations. For example, like useRef is a mutating thing, pretty much, right? Like, so you gotta like, it's actually quite difficult because then you got to know both the benefits of functional programming when it's kind of like how it's used and what are the benefits it provides in React and why people choose to program that way. But then at the same time, you got to remember that JavaScript and React is not purely functional. So you actually do want to make compromises in certain cases. Absolutely. That would, and it would make your code a lot leaner. Yeah. And I think it's the same for JavaScript in general. Like, I see JavaScript as being semi-functional, but like I love how it I love how you have the flexibility to go functional in places where it's necessary, but that you're not forced into it. And I think that React is the same way. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So you if you're working with like a large, body of devs, you're definitely going to meet the two extremes, like people that are just purists in function. They're like, this is technically wrong, I want everything to be immutable.
Yeah, you're changing a variable one time.
It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't use let even though like it doesn't really matter, to be honest, because you're just trying to work out a value in that scope. And then you have the people on the opposite direction, which knows nothing about functional, and then they will create components and like just weird utils that just completely break the pattern.
Yeah, or they have like my object dot render, and they try to change the render method. Anyways,
something ridiculous.
But I think that's those kinds of people. So you have two groups of people on the two ends of the spectrum. One end are functional programming purists. But then on the other end are not people who hate functional programming, but people who haven't properly understood it and haven't properly learned to apply it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's still very important in order to not be on this end, is to have at least some degree of appreciation and knowledge of FP, of functional programming.
Yeah. But I think either extremes are wrong. Like React is somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere.
Probably leaning more functional, but still in the middle somewhere.
Absolutely. And also like in Node.js as well, like with Express, like quite functional as well. In some sense. So it's very, very nice to know if you're working in Node.js. And the other thing, of course, is if you want to learn React, you must understand React itself really well. Now, this is like another level of problem. So before I was talking about, before jumping into React, you need to know JavaScript well. But now people are actually going one step further. Because there are so many huge libraries with tons of stars based on React, people are like skipping React and trying to go to like, go straight to Redux, go straight to styled components, final form, whatever it might be, on top of GraphQL, Sagas, when they don't actually understand React itself that well. But the problem is that when you don't understand React, how are you going to use a React library, a React framework? It's not going to happen that well. So you must understand just a couple of things I've got here listed is a couple of things. So virtual DOM, the diffing algorithm that React uses, you don't have to understand the source code, but you need to know what exactly goes on behind the scenes. The component lifecycle, so when it mounts, what the constructor does, when to use component did mount, when to work with, now we have hooks, use effect, and all the things there. One thing is the React 15, the new context API. It's important to understand that and when to store data in that, because that's used a lot as well. Number 5 is state management. So old-fashioned set state and this.state, and understanding how that works well and how to use it properly is actually surprisingly rare. I would say surprisingly rare. Because there
what was that?
So with state management, it's actually proper use of set state is actually surprisingly rare, I would say. And like using it well within a React app, and like not overusing state and also not overusing Redux, finding that right balance, and I think that's incredibly important as well.
Yeah, that's quite rare. Probably takes multiple refactors to get that right anyway, and
because it changes so much based on requirements.
Refactor. Yes, agreed. Like a new feature comes and you're like, oh crap! I guess now another page needs to know about this.
Yeah, exactly. But then it's not, the solution is not to put everything in global. That's definitely not the way to go. So you start off as local as possible, and then where you need to expand that, right?
Yeah, pretty much. React 15, by the way, it's the React 16 context that is the new one, but 15 is the old one. But you should understand, like, well, I think what we meant was the transition between 15 and 16.
Right, okay.
Yeah, because 15 was still usable.
Wait, so because 16's the right? Because
15.
Their name went from 0.
You did the.
I did a video on that. It's still on YouTube actually. No, because it went from 0.14 to 15 or to 0.15. To 15.
I don't know.
And then it went to 16. I don't know. Anyways, the new context API versus the old one. So the old one was kind of weird. It used prop types. It was a little bit experimental. New one's completely different. It's important to know both and understand both there.
Yep. So theoretically, React 16 context can replace Redux and all other state management libraries. It's just ugly.
Theoretically, it can.
It's just ugly.
And the thing is that, like, when you start using, this is kind of the same argument with database ORMs as well. Is like when you try to do your own context and try to do your own thing to a certain extent, you just realize that you've rewrote Redux, and then at that point it's like, okay, why didn't I just use it in the first place? Yeah,
exactly. And a little bit with number 6, I think we're in this weird state right now where they're trying to move people away from Redux in a way, like they're trying to kind of merge the boundary between what's context, what's Redux, and maybe have these hooks that ship out of the box that kind of does most of it, as well as some of the other stuff. But hooks is not there yet. Like 100%, you cannot truly do everything in hooks.
That's true. Yeah.
elegantly.
Especially like because obviously error boundaries just doesn't work. But there are certain cases where it's so messy because let's just say you have a component that deals a lot with the keyboard, right? You have like different keyboard inputs, different parts. Like the amount of code for that is a solid 200 lines, but then ordering it properly inside of a functional component is it's a nightmare. And also like imagine working with D3 inside of hooks, like that's just not it's not as nice.
Just do spell.
So
yeah. It's just impossible.
Yeah. So
yeah.
What's your opinion on this hooks, like general, like the idea of hooks so far?
Oh, it's good. Yeah, it's really good. I think you should. This is the weird thing because like hooks is still relatively new. Maybe 6 months now since February, right? The Feb release. So that's less than 5 months. So the problem is probably the large majority of the web and devs still use class-based methods. So they're not really good at hooks yet.
Yeah, and they don't understand how to properly apply it. All that.
Yeah, and then when you read docs online, right, you would most likely find the solution in the old class component stuff classes. But you really should, I think, use hooks first and try to use hooks first.
I agree.
Because React is moving in that direction. So like you need to kind of move with the framework. And it's for a good reason as well.
Yeah. It's shorter.
So it's weird. Yeah. It's shorter. Yeah. And it's technically also more correct. But it's weird because then you're now in this state where like you're using React, but maybe like half the stuff you read on Stack Overflow is not relevant to you anymore because you kind of need to use hooks.
And I mean, the same thing was for me even when I started React. Because when I started, like at the time, I didn't understand how to get JSX working properly. So I was like halfway between, like, I saw some code that used React.createElement. I saw some that used JSX, I didn't know when to put in the tag and in, like, it just, none of it really made sense to me. But now we actually have a lot more clarity there. So you can just use Parcel, or if you're adventurous, Webpack, Create React App. You got those solutions. And with hooks, it's important to understand now that, like, a lot of libraries as well also do provide hook support out of the box, and they have that available. But you might just need to do a bit more searching for the docs. And once you understand, so I think, even if you can't find the hooks documentation, if you understand how the class-based state, the set state and all that works properly, then you can take that and you can apply the same principles to hooks, and it actually helps a lot. So when I understood that use effect is basically a great way to replace component did mount and component will unmount, when you have both of those, then it's like, oh, this makes sense to me. I can just do this instead of that. So understanding classes as well, for me personally, was a great way to get into hooks.
Because this is like the bit. So back to what you said about JSX, right? So I think I started at a similar time where, like, honestly, so much of the like introduction, getting started docs were using React.createElement. They didn't use JSX, but nowadays it's like you're not going to see.
And they also had like React.create class.
It's just going to be JSX
and classes.
All these like
so weird.
All this weird stuff. So I think, but nowadays like you never see that. No one will even talk about it. It just happens in the background. Just use JSX, Don't even bother with it. So I think hooks will get to that state where, like, eventually don't even bother with class, just use hooks. But right now, you kind of have to know both.
Yeah. And speaking of things that I must know, I would say that I've got 3 things here for must know libraries. Like, I think if you're doing React and you don't know these, well, I think you're going to be hard pressed to find employment, in my opinion. Yeah, I would say that.
I guess.
Like, as a React dev, yes.
I mean, interestingly, a lot of React jobs, a lot of companies that hire React people don't even test React. They just test vanilla JavaScript.
That is true, though, yeah.
So I find that weird, but yes, anyway.
And I mean, it goes to show, like, React is not, like, it's mostly JavaScript. That's important here. But I would say number 1 is Redux. Redux is somewhat controversial, quite a large boilerplate, quite a large footprint in terms of the amount of code you have to write. But very useful to know, especially for the concept of unidirectional data flow and like kind of like a Flux implementation. React Router is kind of like the end-all be-all of routing in your browser, and also in part on native, but native on React Native you have some other options as well. But React Router is pretty much the only one ubiquitous here. A CSS in JS library. So personally, I've used CSS modules as well. So CSS modules is like a way that that's like implemented in Webpack and also in Parcel in bundlers to help you modularize, like basically changes your CSS class names and IDs and gives you a map between the original name and the ID. So that way your class names don't clash between components. It's pretty cool, but I would actually suggest using a CSS and JS library. My actual recommendation would be Emotion. There's a reason I don't really like styled components, and for that you can check out a previous episode of Tech Red Pill. But yeah, those three things I think are incredibly important, and I think that you kind of should know them, need to understand them to some degree, and would be really beneficial for you in your job situation. Is there anything else that you think would be like highly recommended or a must know?
Not really. I think the one thing left out is async stuff. So none of these libraries deal with async stuff. So you're probably going to cross that path eventually.
So maybe like Axios?
Thunk. Yeah, Axios, Thunk, Saga. Like there will be some kind of asynchronous stuff that will screw you over if you don't have certain libraries. I think when you said Redux was controversial, it's like, it's so funny because yes, it is, but the reason it's controversial is because like, I guess there are so many. It's not really an anti-pattern, but it kind of feels like it in some ways, right? Because the store is like, it's just like an object somewhere, and you kind of subscribe to it.
Yeah.
A store is in some ways not.
It feels like it's not actually part of React. It's like they developed it first, and then they said, "Hey, let's join this into React." So it's like this weird,
But it is so like practically useful and beneficial. Like the trade-off of it is so damn big that it's impossible to not use it. So this says a lot about ties in a lot about like coding style. Is like sometimes you want to make the pragmatic like decision if it just means much better maintainability. Like you got to think about all the non-technical trade-offs as well.
And also because Redux is so popular that like many people know it. So, it's much easier to hire a Redux dev than, some obscure library.
Yeah. React Router, agreed. You have to know it. Even if you pick another one, you have to know React Router if you want routing, which you probably do. CSS and JS, I'm maybe not as strong on this one. Like you probably want to use some stuff, but like if you have Webpack and CSS modules, you don't necessarily need to do it. Especially because some people don't do CSS, right? Like they just use
that is true
material, and then they just like respect material and just have one like global style sheet to hotfix and patch.
Oh, really?
Things.
Wow. That's a really big anti-pattern though, right? Like having your React styles outside of your component in a global. Like that seems like a bad idea.
I agree. Well, but what if it's like fixes to material UI?
Okay.
Like that kind of stuff, right? So the idea is they want to adopt like a full-on component framework. Theoretically, it does everything you need to do, but of course that's not always. That's never the case, right? So you need to hack certain things sometimes.
And I would say like the reason is because like especially if you're learning, you're looking for opportunities, and I think that these play such a huge role in React nowadays that it's good to know. That would be kind of my point of view, is like understanding because it's so different. Like CSS and JS is a concept that is so like it wasn't the case with jQuery at all. So this is something relatively new and also a good pattern to understand. So that's why I would say that it's good to know that. All right.
Yeah, I agree, to be honest.
Yeah.
Probably need to.
Well, now we're down to unidirectional data flow. Are there any comments you want to make on this one?
I mean, not really. It's just understanding like by unidirectional, you just mean the whole component rendering kind of life cycle, right? And in specific, I think it links to Redux because that's where the big cycle happens with Connect and everything. Not too much really. I think a lot of it might be like optimization related if you want to mess with anything about that. Which I think optimization's a weird thing, but we can talk about that later on.
Yeah, optimization. Like as a React dev, I think the most important thing is like to avoid. There are many well documented anti-patterns out there, and it's just important that if you see something and like someone tells you this is bad, probably a good idea to consider why it is bad and maybe step away from it. And I think a final note would be to learn and to keep reading about React and keep watching videos. Personally, I find that the videos made by the React team are like the most helpful things. For example, Dan Abramov, he has a blog called Overreacted, great to read. He has YouTube talks as well. I just finished watching a talk just a while ago by Andrew Clark, also on the team at the moment. So, just understanding these things, learning about them, and always looking to improve yourself in the world of React and JavaScript. Any closing thoughts before we end off this video?
Yeah, actually, I do. I remember there's this question that someone raised was like, we gave a junior dev a page. Just imagine a form, right? And we're like, just build this form page. Go ahead, use React, figure it out yourself. And then he didn't really know how to slice the thing up into components properly. Like, he was trying to slice up like every div,
right?
As a component. Yeah, like so. I would say like just be kind of use your common sense as to how cut up your app is, right? Like if a certain thing does one thing, just keep it together, even if it's like a few things. So for example, you might have a row of buttons, right? OK and cancel or something like that. You can have 2 buttons and render it separately, but if it makes sense for your app, you can technically just have like button
row or something
as a component. Yeah, like something like that, and then just put it there, like navigation buttons or something, right? So just slice it in a way that makes the code easier to follow.
And would you say that is actually one of the things that is quite object-oriented about React, is like the splitting of components? Like that's a concept that comes like strongly from object-oriented programming, right? Because like you've got like, because it's splitting functionality into different classes, different components.
Yeah, I see what you mean there. I think yes.
And also encapsulation of data inside of components as well.
Yes, that's pretty much very OO like. Definitely, because you have like class properties. You still do.
Yeah.
So yes, but it's a bit of a red herring. It kind of misleads you down the. Yeah, like if you're a Java dev, right? It seems like a good idea, right? Because that's what you do, bread and butter. But no, don't do that.
Don't be a Java dev.
Don't do that.
Yeah. All right.
You can read up about extending and composing if you want to know why. But anyway.
Okay,
yes.
well, that's it for this video. I hope that it's been helpful. We've been covering getting started to React, what to do, what not to do, what libraries you should know, what kind of data design patterns, and just our general thoughts on the whole thing. This has been Lucas and Patrick with Better Coding Academy, and see you guys next time.